All right, so the Aggrey Klaaste Trust, in partnership with Sowetan, the journalism department at the University of the Witwatersrand, the South African National Editors Forum and DM5 Attorneys are currently hosting a virtual Aggrey Klaaste Annual Colloquium. The aim is to commemorate the events that took place on the 19th of October 1977, the infamous Black Wednesday. Let's take you live now to the proceedings.
No, many more were also involved. In one of his columns, sharing with us his experience of the day, Dr. Klaaste said, "Many of us were so incensed with the events preceding October 19, 1977, that detention seemed inevitable, almost the honorable thing to happen to one." Apart from his dedication to fighting the apartheid regime, on the eve of the birth of democratic South Africa, he told us that we had to start building a nation, one that was broken by the brutality of the apartheid regime. On August 1990, Dr. Aggrey Klaaste delivered to us the Nation Building Manifesto, where he said, and I quote, "Nation building means picking up the pieces that have collapsed in our communities. It means striving for the best in all that we do for ourselves and our people. It is the search for the acquisition and control of structures of power required for the survival of a nation. It is creating an efficient leadership and increasing the value and quality of life among all inhabitants of our country for ourselves and our children. Nation building is our hope for the future," close quote. Former President Nelson Mandela said of Mr. Klaaste, "He will never be forgotten because he loved this country. He was an inspiring man and extremely talented." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the legacy that Mr. Klaaste has left us. One, it is love for country, and two, courageous journalism. And together, with those two, we can build a nation. To formally welcome us, I am going to call upon Mr. Franz Kruger, Professor Franz Kruger, who of course is the head of Wits Journalism and the director of the Wits Radio Academy. Franz, is over to you. Franz, can you hear us? It looks like we have just lost Professor Franz Kruger. He was going to, of course, welcome us to this inaugural Aggrey Klaaste lecture. And while we wait for him to rejoin us, I'm just going to introduce you to the rest of the panel that will be with us this afternoon. Of course, we've got Dr. Joe Crowley, who is the chair of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. We also have Mrs. Nwabisa Makunga, who is the editor-in-chief of the Sowetan, of course, a publication that Mr. Klaaste is closely associated with. My chairperson, Sbu Ngalwa, who is also the political editor of Newsroom Africa. We've also got with us Dr. Tami Mazwai, who is, of course, with the National Planning Commission. And, of course, we also have Mr. Styli Karambolis. And I'm going to try that one more time because I know I've just butchered that surname despite trying it so many times. Karalambos. I hope I got it right, who's, of course, is with the Daily Maverick. I see Professor Kruger has rejoined us. I was handing over to you just to formally welcome us.
Thanks, Mahlatse, and yes, apologies. I think it's the nature of the beast that one gets cut off from time to time, and it wasn't even an inadvertent pressing of the mute button this time. But yes, thanks very much for those warm words, and thanks for welcoming us, Mahlatse. And from my side, I really just want to say a very warm welcome to everyone, the panelists, as well as those who've joined us for this very important and very interesting discussion. I mean, this is, as you've said, hopefully the inaugural Aggrey Klaaste Annual Colloquium, with the topic this year of surviving 2020 and media credibility going forward. It's an important discussion. And of course, the situation that confronts the media in this year, 2020, is complex and difficult. I was struck early on when you were quoting Aggrey Klaaste's words from so many years ago, how on the one hand, we are in a different country. We have constitutionally guaranteed rights to media freedom. And at the same time, some of the things that he says are so fresh and so current. And I think it is a really good choice and a good combination to mark this day, Media Freedom Day, where we mark the clampdown of 1977, while at the same time honoring one of the leaders, one of the really outstanding journalists of that time. And it invites us to compare the things that have changed and the things that have not. So without further ado, I want to hand everyone back to you. But I do want to say from the side of Wits Journalism, a really warm thanks to all of the partners, the Sowetan, DM5 law firm, the South African National Editors Forum, and of course the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. I remember when Jerome Klaaste came to see us, I think about a year ago, to say, why don't we do this thing? It seemed a long time to prepare, and the time has gone very quickly in some ways since then. But it was a great initiative, and I'm very happy to see it come to fruition today. I look forward to the discussion. I look forward to the input from everyone. And back to you, Mashatsi.
Thank you very, very much, Frans, for those welcoming words. Of course, we are also looking forward to hearing from you guys, our participants. If you do have questions, please use the chat box. And if they are directed to anybody in particular, just mention that. And I will then pose the questions to our different panel members. We are very lucky that we live and can share space with heroes amongst us. So it gives me really great pleasure to welcome now and hand over to Dr. Joe Crowley, a man, of course, who has been around and can be able to tell us of the media of October 1977 and compare that to the current crisis facing the media now. And of course, we learn and absorb as much as we can as we celebrate people like you who have contributed so much to our democracy. Of course, Dr. Joe Crowley is also the chairperson of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust.
Thanks, Mashatsi. Can I start by quoting a poem that would be a very good backdrop to our discussions today? It was written by a television journalism trainer, Tim Knight. Once upon a time, people told stories. How the world was born, where the people came from, who the people were, why the people were, how evil and good wrestled endlessly for their souls. Days darkened, flames flickered, shadows played, and the people huddled close as the storyteller told of death and birth, and devils and gods, and rogues and heroes. And the journey, always the journey, through space and time and mortal minds. The journey from birth to death and beyond. The search for the meaning of it all. The stories explained who we are, why we are, how we came, why we go, where we go, and the meaning of it all. Always, always the meaning of it all. Of death and life, evil and good, hate and love, wrong and right, lust, pride, greed, losing, winning, hell and heaven. Always the meaning, from the beginning of the story to the end. So it was that the people learned and understood. So it is that the people can still learn and understand. For we are the storytellers, and we have to learn to tell stories again so we can bring understanding again. I think this is a beautiful summary of our craft. (1977). Today we reflect on the events of that day. At the time, the story was quite simple. You are either for or against apartheid. It was a simple story. Now, journalists place themselves at various points in this continuum. Some completely against apartheid, some dancing with apartheid, and others positioning themselves somewhere in between. On that day, the bully boys of apartheid, guns, jackboots, walked into the office of the World, shut the newspaper down, and carted Percy Goboza, the editor, and Aggrey Klaaste to jail. That was apartheid in action. It was brutal. Now, unfortunately, I got news of these events long after they had happened, because on the 19th of October 1977, I was already in jail. I had been detained almost for 6 months in solitary confinement while they tortured me, trying to extract a story that I didn't believe in. That story seemed to end happily for us when apartheid ended in 1994. We danced around, with joyful that this monster had come to an end. And in 1996, when Section 16 of our Constitution was proclaimed, we danced some more, particularly we the journalists. Because in Section 16, it guaranteed us freedom of the press and freedom of the media. What we had been fighting all these years, what the Percy Gobozas and the Aggrey Klaastes had sacrificed for. But now, sadly, our dreams, our hopes have been shattered. We are now back in crisis. The old model of the media has been shattered. The old media was quite simple. You got as big an audience as possible, and you sold these figures to the advertisers. And the advertisers and the audience paid somewhat for the creation of news, for the packaging of news, for the investigations that happened. That's the old model that is shattered. And that is why we're in crisis today, because we haven't devised a new model yet. Advertisers have fled to the big online operators, because these operators can target their audiences with laser sharp focus. The big boys know our tastes, they know our habits, they know everything about us. So if an advertiser says, I want 15-year-olds who love Nike shoes, they will be able to give that advertiser that particular audience. We, in the old media, the best we can do is offer them just generic audiences. We have so many people who watch our news, who read our newspapers, who read us online. And the advertiser prefers an audience that he can relate to directly. When we try to find solutions, this is the area one area we should be looking at. The audiences that used to pay some of the costs that we carry have also deserted us. They are poorer than they were in 1977, sad to say. They can't afford newspapers. They can't afford airtime. And it's been made worse by COVID-19. So what do our audiences do now? They rely on social media. They rely on on radio, on radio bulletins as they drive to work or away from work. They look at social media and they get their information by osmosis, just knowing generally that things are happening in their country, things are happening in the world. The very critical audiences we had have dwindled. And the irony of this is that today's audiences read much more than they used to. They write much more than they used to. And they are flooded by more information than we've ever had in history. That's the irony of our crisis. Now, another perspective we shouldn't forget when you look at our problems today is the fact that the South African story, the world story, is much more complex than it was in 1977. If we are to do justice to our craft, become the storytellers that Tim was talking about, we have to look at how we tell our story. Are we able to bring the nuances of our story to our readers, to our listeners, to our viewers? Are we able to say, these are the people that I am talking to, and I can then go to advertisers or whoever funds the new model? Can I then say to them, I know my people? We should be models for Mankomo, the lady round the corner. She should be able to say, I have seen this thing on Twitter, but I won't believe it until I have seen it in a credible publication. We need to set ourselves that target and say, how do you get that credibility? Those are some of the issues that we need to look at. Some people might say the crisis in 1977 was more brutal and was more immediate. But let's look around us. How many publications have shut down this year only? How many journalists are without jobs this year only? It's a much more brutal crisis than the 1977 one, because information is the foundation of our democracy. So I'm delighted that the Klaaste Trust, SANEF, and the other sponsors of this particular colloquium have decided we should take time to look at this crisis and say, how do we get out of it? And how do we maintain media credibility going forward? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Hlolwe, for those insightful words. Of course, the financial models have been shattered, and people like Mrs. Nwabisa Makunga have the unenviable task of how do you manage a newsroom under this very difficult financial circumstances. So it's over to you to speak around Black Wednesday and the current state of the newsroom. Nwabisa?
Thank you very much, Mahlatse, and good afternoon to everybody. It's really a privilege for us as the Sowetan to be partnering with the Aggrey Klaaste Trust. I think for obvious reasons, we walk in the footsteps of a giant, and anything we do, we absolutely remember his legacy. And so for us today, it was a no-brainer that we would become part of this very important conversation. So, Mahlatse, you're right. I mean, for me, I think one of the things that really kind of give me sleepless nights is, to manage a newsroom at this particular time in our democracy, but also at this particular time when our economy is really what it is. But I think it's an important thing for us to consistently think about and consistently work at. So I want to talk about just three things that I think for us as practicing journalists at the moment are probably one of our hardest. I think the one is the economic story of the newsroom, as Joe has actually touched on. I think we've seen for the past decade or so, there's really been a bloodbath in our newsrooms, in our industry across the country. We've seen revenues shrink, we've seen circulation drop. And what really that has meant, and I don't know how much the public is cognizant of this, but what is really that has meant is that not only have journalists lost their jobs, but those who do remain, in the newsrooms have to do far more with far less. In fact, I think Professor Glenda Daniels speaks from the University, says she estimates that for the past 10 years or so, that half of South Africa's journalists have actually lost their jobs. Now that is huge, not just from an economic point of view, but from our ability to tell stories, the amount of work we are able to produce, but also importantly, the quality and credibility of work that we are supposed to produce. I think each journalist right now in any newsroom in South Africa, they know, for example, that they're probably doing work of what used to be done by sort of 3 people before that. So what then do we do? And I think the question of business models, comes up, quite often. And I think, yes, there are different models that exist. Some people kind of looking at, paywalls, subscriptions, some people looking at, membership. And in all of those things, I think it's, for all of us, we're trying out to see what is it that works. And I think for me, what's important is for us as journalists to really kind of come together and understand that if we don't find something that does work, that journalism as a craft itself will be very much compromised. And I can't imagine a South Africa that does not have the media industry, particularly if you look at, the work that we've done in the past couple of years. And the second thing is really about, the crisis of what I call the crisis of credibility in our newsrooms. I think there's no doubt, Mahlatse, that particularly over the last 10 years, that our journalists have produced some incredible work, some incredible investigations, really, really exposing, the depths of corruption in this country. And I think for that, we must absolutely be proud. There are many, many examples, some of the colleagues in this call as well. But I also think, there have been situations where, as an industry, we have not covered ourselves in glory. And I think Professor Haber's new book really kind of details some of those aspects, the things that have happened in certain newsrooms and how those not only have destroyed people's lives, but really, assisted in, for example, situations of state capture. And why that is important is that we've seen how it has really kind of set us apart from the audiences that we are trying to serve. We've seen the wedge that it has driven between ourselves as journalists as well as the public that we are serving. And I think we do have a responsibility to try to reverse that. And it really starts from the decisions that we make as editors, every single day, to constantly ask ourselves questions. Is this in the public interest? But not just public interest. Is this for public good? The work that we do, I think it's very easy to kind of, run with headlines and have people talking. But I think if we were to understand the erosion that causes when we do get things wrong, but also not just getting things wrong, but when there was malice, in having done that. Of course, I think there are many aspects where a lot of the things we don't get right aren't really about malice, but they're probably about ignorance, which for me, then raises the question of how much we capacitate our newsrooms, particularly knowing, that there's fewer people in every newsroom. So how much of our journalists do we capacitate, and what tools do we really give them to be able to do the job that they need to do? It's important. And the third thing I'd really want to talk about is what I believe are really, an increasing number of attacks on journalists. And these attacks, and I know, Joe speaks about really what they went through some 40 years ago. And I don't think that what we experience now, obviously, is at that scale. But I think we would be naive to believe that what we do experience now does not have a systemic, eroding impact on our society. I think we've seen many, many examples where, particularly on social media, journalists are basically maligned, and in particular by people who are involved in, or are suspected to be involved in acts of corruption, etc. And the important thing for me with that is really to partner with the public to say, what is actually happening here is not just about the journalists themselves. So it's not just about dehumanizing journalists, attacking female journalists in particular, but it's really about building a society where nobody trusts anything that comes from the media. And when that happens, I think we should all worry, because when that happens, there's nobody who can actually speak out against any kind of, corruption or anything of the sort that happens in our country. And I think there are certain questions that we need to ask ourselves, indeed, in partnering with the public and the people that we serve. But also there's perhaps a media literacy that needs to happen. The rise of fake news is quite dangerous for our country. And I think when we push that message and help people actually understand, that this is that we're here to do this kind of work, and not just that, but we need a media that is credible and that can be trusted. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. That was Nwabisa Makunga, who is the editor-in-chief of the Sowetan, which of course was home to Dr. Aggrey Klaaste. And of course, she's also the Treasurer General of the South African National Editors Forum. As Matata said, is that freedom also needs defenders. So we've had the likes of Aggrey Klaaste, Joe Crowley, and Dr. Tami Mazwai fighting for Section 16 of our Constitution. But now we need to be defending that Constitution, especially in the face of those that want to threaten the media to silence them as they expose the rot or expose their hands in the cookie jar. And now to the chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum, Sibungalwa. And of course, the big question, and Nwabisa also touched on it here, media credibility, sustainability, and COVID-19 in the newsroom. Of course, we would like to blame all of our troubles on COVID-19, but we know that we have been in trouble for quite a number of years, and COVID-19 simply pushed many of us over the edge, but also our credibility has been in question.
Thank you very much, Mahlatsi, and good afternoon to the panelists. And I must say that I'm quite honored to be part of this inaugural Aggrey Klaaste Annual Colloquium under the theme of surviving 2020 and media credibility going forward. And I think, Mahlatsi, what you just said kind of underlines the fact that we never thought, never in our wildest dreams did we ever imagine that we would ever have to talk about surviving a particular year. That's just how devastating 2020 has been and COVID-19 has been to the industry. But just before I get to the issues of the sustainability of the sector, I'll touch on briefly on some of the trends that we have seen and some of the impact that we've seen which COVID-19 has wrought onto our industry. I think while we may have seen the downturn in terms of the media subscriptions, publications closing down, and also journalists losing jobs, the reality is that we've seen citizens increasing their reliance on the internet and digital technologies for their daily survival. And I think that that is important as we are dealing with the current crisis. But also at the same time, the reality is that we've seen the demise of the traditional media models, which has resulted, as I said, in the downscaling and closure of many media outlets and loss of countless jobs in journalism. But be that as it may, we also see an over-reliance on social media platforms. While it may be good on the one hand, but the reality is that we do have the issue of the filter bubbles on social media, where many people are actually exposed to those who think alike. And I think that also increases and provides a fertile ground for the spreading of disinformation. And I think that as we are grappling with these questions about the sustainability of our sector, at the same time, it happens at a time when we, as the South African National Editors Forum, having identified the issues that afflict us as an industry, had already taken a decision to set up the media ethics inquiry as far back as 2018. Now, that media ethics inquiry obviously was, they began their work last year. That's the inquiry that is led by Judge Kathleen Satchwell. And Mahlatsi, I think it is important to point out that we did say 2 months ago that the report of the judge would be ready by the end of September. I just want to update to say that the report of the judge on the ethics of the media industry will be ready in the next few weeks, as it is now undergoing a few editing process and finalization. Just to take you back why we got to that point. We got to that point where we set up this inquiry because, as you would recall, that there were a number of apologies that were made in the various publications, more famously the Sunday Times, around the issues of the rogue unit stories and the Cato Mena death squad. But we thought that while we acknowledge that it is important, especially at a time when the media is under attack from various quarters around its credibility, that we have an industry-wide process which looks at the integrity of journalism. And that is why we set up that commission led by the Judge Satchwell. And I think that the other important thing here, Mahlatsi, is that we are sitting here now discussing the fact that we've lost so many hundreds of jobs and no less than 80 publications have closed down. The issue of media sustainability is an important one and an urgent one for the various reasons, for this following reason. I'm currently joining this colloquium from the Eastern Cape, a province which has earned itself a badge of infamy as the most corrupt province in the country. But I argue today that the Eastern Cape does not carry that badge because it is the most corrupt province in this country, but it is because of the strong local media publications in this region that are able to, that day in, day out, expose corruption within government and in all sectors of society. You will recall that a few weeks ago, Judge Zondo sat there and exasperated the Deputy Chief Justice, saying that he could not believe that so much corruption could be happening in one province, and that was the Free State. And he wondered to himself aloud whether the corruption that he was seeing in the Free State, as to what does the picture look like in other provinces. Now we know what is happening in the Eastern Cape because of exactly those strong local media. But we have no idea of the extent of corruption in a province like Mpumalanga or the Northwest. Now, I think this, for me, underlines the importance of local media and why it is important for us as a country, as society, and as stakeholders to actually start the serious conversations around the importance of the sustainability of the media industry. Because even if you're going back to the Zondo Commission once again, the evidence that relates to all the corruption in the Free State, all of that evidence which relates to the politicians that were paid, the monies that found that were embezzled, close to R1 billion, all of that is included in the beautiful investigative work of journalist Peter Louis Mayberg. If you look at his book, Gangster State, it actually details all of that information, which then says, once again, that part of the revelations that we see coming out of the Zondo Commission are actually not revelations, because then it's not new information. It's information that the meticulous work of journalists like Peter Louis Mayberg, the meticulous and good work that is done by strong local publications like the Daily Dispatch in the Eastern Cape and the Herald in Port Elizabeth have been exposing for a number of years now. So for us, I think the most crucial thing is that as we start this conversation, we should actually, it's important that we now will be having this media ethics inquiry report coming out at a time when we're facing COVID-19. Because as we're going forward, it is important to first look at ourselves, because we as SANEF, even in our publication, in our submission to the inquiry, we said that there is no doubt that the conduct of some journalists has actually contributed to the undermining and the credibility of the media. So it is important that we look at ourselves before we can look at ways in which we can improve ourselves. Now, the question is, what do we do? And what are these different models? That will be touched on some of them, what we can do in terms of sustainability of the media industry. I think the most important thing for us is the issue of universal internet access and digital equality. And we do know for a fact that we have less than 60% of South Africans who are able to use the internet. Now, that not only underlines the need for urgent steps by government and its agencies to make sure that they roll out broadband internet access across the country and provide, at the very least, the basic level of free internet access to all. That is why we are saying that we at least need to make sure that South Africans have access to information and credible news organizations, and that government and all of us should be part of efforts to ensure that at the very least that all South Africans have access to free or zero-rated internet access so that they can exercise their basic human right, which is access to government information, where they can be able to access jobs, where they can be able to look for news, and where they can also, students, as we know that they currently also do receive free internet, in fact, zero-rated access, because some of the universities have already been zero-rated. So what we're saying is that I think that it should actually extend to credible news media organizations. How we get to that is a conversation that we will have. But I think as I wrap up, also the most important thing is that last week I participated in a panel by the International Press Institute. And there are lessons we can learn from other parts of the world. For instance, in the US, they're already having conversations about calling on the government to make newspaper subscriptions or their media subscription tax deductible, which can encourage people to buy these subscriptions. And we know that in countries like New Zealand, they've already started their own media fund where government is waiving waives transmission fees for broadcasters, and also makes sure that all government departments and agencies in all spheres of government buy paid subscriptions to support the local media. And I think that the examples I make about the role that is played by local media in our democracy and the media in general in our democracy cannot be overstated, because we are where we are. We're listening every day to all this fascinating information, and we have our eyes wide open, disbelieving some of the information that is coming out. And it is precisely because of the role that the media plays. And that is why it is important that beyond COVID-19, we should still be able to have a sustainable media industry in this country. I think with those words, Chairperson, I think I've exhausted my 10 minutes. Thank you very much. I'll hand it over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just to add this, Boo, that as the South African National Editors Forum, we are also taking up President Cyril Ramaphosa's offer to assist in ensuring that we have a sustainable industry. And we will be convening a meeting with the presidency to see how we get government to actually come to the party and find ways to make sure that the health of our democracy, which is dependent on a credible media, is actually protected. Thank you very much, Sibusiso Ngalwa, who is the chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum and also political editor for Newsroom Africa. And of course, also with us on this panel is Dr. Tami Mazwai from the National Planning Commission, and somebody whose roots are in the media and in that fighting spirit of the media of Black Wednesday. And it's over to you, Dr. Mazwai, to speak to us on what is the way forward.
Thanks very much, Mahlase, and I also want to give my greetings to the scores of people who are part and parcel of this colloquium, and also to my fellow panelists. I will first and foremost kick off by saying that I think that I am delighted about what is happening today. Although, I must be honest, I believe that this should have happened ages ago. Should have happened ages ago because when 1994 dawned, it was quite obvious that the media as we know it would have to reinvent itself. Unfortunately, that did not happen. I am delighted that the ethics inquiry is going to report is going to be released, and it's going to be to focus perhaps on the conduct of journalists, because there are certain behaviors that have really made us very, very worried about the direction which the media is taking. Although you cannot describe individual journalists as the media, but they slay the name, the image of the media in many ways. And secondly, it is about time for this soul searching, because I believe that when we were confronted with apartheid in the 70s and 80s, we did our level best to present the news as they were, without taking sides, but letting the reader being the ultimate judge. Unfortunately, today, when you look at the split in the ruling party, you find that they also reflect themselves with journalists and with publication. That is very, very sad. But the issue goes much more deeper. I did mention that I was part of the media in 1994, and we did not, as an industry, sit down and conceptualize our role in society. Individual media houses may have done so, but to what extent has the industry and even SANEF done so? And I accept responsibility for this because I was the first chairperson of a SANEF. And I'm saying this because before 1994, when we looked at the media, we find that the relationship between the media and Black South Africa was disparaging politically, socially, and economically. The African community, the Black African community, was those people. Today, it's 2020. To what extent has that image changed of those people? With all respect, I find that the Black community is still those people. And I say this because I am a regular follower of the media, and there is no doubt in me that we seldom give the figures that I'm just about to give on a regular basis to wake South Africa up to the realities of their country. There are over 40 million South Africans, the majority Black, 95%, who live on less than 1,200 rand per person per month. The unemployed people, it's 10 million. When we look at the inequality, it is at the highest in the world, 0.78 when you use the Gini coefficient. Now, these are the features of what is essentially a country that is crying out for redress. But this does not reflect itself in the pages, in today's pages and in news reports. Instead, the reality that is projected is the reality of white South Africa. I am not blind to the fact that the media has done a stunning job in terms of exposing corruption in our society. It has done a stunning job. It must be very proud of itself. But beyond that, there is this story of misery that Joe referred to. There is this story of young children who go to school and get food from the from the system by the government of giving children food, and some of the children don't eat that food, and they take it home because their families have now come to depend on that food. This is the misery that I'm talking of. That Greater South Africa is not aware of. Now, we now have got to talk of the credibility of the media, because credibility is the extent to which society trusts you. And when you ignore people to the extent that we do, the trust erodes. And when that trust erodes, we then have a situation in which people become victim to other forms of media which really are so populist and will drive our country into further problem. I am akin to the fact that the model that we need a new model. Yes, I agree, because technology has moved on and social structures have adapted to the new forms of communication, of getting news. But whatever new type of media that we come with, that it has got to enjoy the trust of society. And when I say the trust of society, that it has got to reflect our realities as a country, and not a certain idealism that you find that reflects only the lifestyles of the minority. The last point I would like to make is also to encourage SANEF to really have the meeting with the president, because we cannot afford to have a South Africa that does not have a vigilant media. We simply can't afford that. But what can also be looked at is that in 1995, there was a workshop that was held in the Western Cape. It was chaired by Joel Nechitenze. And one of the issues that were put on the table was the Swedish model. The Swedish model had the government subsidize media, and the media, to protect itself, had strict rules of operation so that they did not have to betray the trust of the millions of people on the ground. When we suggested this, everybody who was there denounced it and said, we cannot afford to have for government funding, because we'll now become government puppies. If at all being funded by government makes us government puppies, when we are being funded by advertisers, is there any difference in that? And so on. So that argument just did not hold. But the point is that at the time, we were so anti-government, or certain of us were so anti-government, that they refused to see a difference between a democratic government and a non-democratic government. Everything was government. So I would like to encourage the media to have an open mind when discussing this, but to know that their primary responsibility is to protect the integrity of the media, its independence, so that the ordinary man in the street has got trust in it, because it is only that credibility that guarantees its existence into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Mazwai. Some pointed criticism there, and very fair criticism, I must add, because we do know that the trust barometer between the media and the public has been declining, and perhaps part of it is that we are not telling the South African story with all its not always glory, but also reflecting the real lived experiences of South Africans. And I just want to say to my panelists that I will be posing that question to you much later on in terms of whether there is anything wrong in receiving government funding, given that we are finding ourselves in difficult financial times. And the last speaker on our panel, and of course one that has very much lived up to its name, they are finding new funding models for the industry. They are the people that launched a newspaper at a time when everybody was, of course, shutting down and finding themselves in really precarious financial situation. So I'm now going to be handing over to the CEO of the Daily Maverick, Styli Kharalambos, on where to from now.
Thank you, Klaaste, and thank you, everyone, for having me here today. And what a pleasure it is to be part of this event today with all my co-panelists, and in celebration of an incredibly important person and part of our history to remember as part of the media fraternity. I've been asked to speak today a little bit about where to now. What are the possibilities and the avenues for media sustainability, and the opportunities for us to get through this problem that is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing at the moment. What I would like to share with you today is start with a little bit of a history lesson going back to 1958. The average lifespan of the S&P 500 listed company was 61 years. Now, this is just an illustration of what that is like today. If you could take a guess, that has now moved from 61 years down to a lifespan of 18 years, just 18 years from 1958. And by 2030, McKinsey estimates that 75% of S&P 500 companies will be gone. What has that got to do with media? well, disruption comes for every company and every industry. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, why are we surprised that it has come for us? And that we are not immune to something that has been happening to every company and every industry since inception. So where are we now? I would say that media sustainability is the biggest of our challenges and our threats at the moment. If we're not sustainable, then I guess we aren't in a position to be receiving all the other threats that come with being in this profession. I think one of the biggest causes of that is the struggle for legacy media companies to transform digitally. And what we have seen now with the shift to the dominance of Google and Facebook and other big Silicon Valley-based giants is we've seen the industry has transformed from local oligopolies who had big hurdles big entrance hurdles or licenses that they could use to prevent new entrants into the market. That has now shifted to a place of global oligopolies now absorbing most of the revenue that comes into the media industry. But the good news is that we have a map. The New York Times has put together two incredibly important documents of our time. I would probably say these rank as two of the most important documents, if not the most important documents of our times. And I would suggest, in my opinion, that every journalism school in the world and every newsroom in the world take some time to study these two documents. The first was the Innovation Report, which was published in 2014. And then a follow-up to that was Journalism That Stands Apart, which was published in January 2017. These documents acknowledge the shortcomings of the behemoth of the New York Times in 2014 and where they were failing in their digital transformation process and what was holding them back. It was an honest and frank assessment of the fact that print was still dominating their thinking, their newsroom and their business practices, and that they needed to desperately and urgently replace these with digital strategies, skills, and the right people, and to move to become a digital first and subscriptions first business. To their credit, they've implemented and have been successful in executing most of the elements of both of these reports, but it is possible that it can be done, and the New York Times has shown us the way and given us very detailed instructions in these two documents. A quote from the 2017 document in Journalism That Stands Apart by Dean Baquet, the New York Times executive editor, was this: "Make no mistake, this is the only way to protect our journalistic ambitions. To do nothing or to be timid in imagining the future would mean being left behind." And this was in response to the statement that they made and the ambition to double their digital revenues by 2020 to $800 million. But this transformation requires us to take on new skills and to create new functions within our organizations. And these will be foreign to us, especially those legacy media operations. And I'm talking about functions and skills like data science, product and technology, business to consumer marketing, e-commerce, community management, and thinking and acting and building like entrepreneurs. A lot of this is going to require significant changes in our organizations, not only in the business side, but also how the newsroom interacts and how the product and technology teams play that intermediate role between the newsroom and the other facets of the business. We're also going to be required to create diversified revenue streams. In the past, the game was the same. Advertising and cover price revenues was pretty much the same cookie cutter that any media organization around the world would follow. That was the formula. You would just go out and chase that. Now it is, in my estimation, that every newsroom or every media organization requires up to 6 significant revenue streams to create a place of sustainability. To achieve it requires a different formula for every single media house. And that depends on how you're funded, the skills and the resources that you have available, and the editorial vision that you have. And in that lies one of the biggest challenges, because now we have to go out and create our own bespoke revenue and diversification plan. In the past, we had this cookie cutter that we could just apply. This requires us to have a vision of where we want to get to and a plan of how we're going to get there, and it's unique to us and takes a lot of hard work and introspection and knowing our audiences before you can do that. So how do we get there? It's all down to one thing. It's leadership. Leadership is a thing that can move an organization from a place of crisis to a place of sustainability, and even beyond that into profitability and success. It requires us having a vision, a clearly articulated vision that can be shared within the organization and to all our stakeholders, a plan of how to get from A to B, a plan of how we want the culture of our organizations to be like. A lot of our newsrooms, a lot of our media organizations are toxic workplaces that have been compromised either by economics or politics. It requires us making resource allocations in order to staff and to adequately resource the different initiatives that we need to get there. It requires us to invest in our people. It requires us to invest in new people, and require across the board, right down from the most junior intern right up to the CEO, for everyone to lift their game, because we do not currently have the skills and the training and development that's required for us to get there as it stands. It also requires us to make innovation part of our culture. If the average lifespan of an S&P 500 company is just 18 years, it means you have to be continuously regenerating, creating new ideas, new business opportunities, and finding ways that you can expand on what you've done already. And all this is going to be the North Star for me in all of this is one where we get to a place of data-driven audience centricity. Data, because it will allow us to make better decisions. And audience centricity is that thing which allows us never to leave the North Star, which is that we are in a public service business. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Styli, for those very important pointers as we try and find ways to safeguard and to sustain our industry. Ladies and gentlemen, those that are just joining us, I saw in the past 10 minutes, we've just had more people joining us. Of course, this is the inaugural Aggrey Klaaste Annual Colloquium, and the topic is Surviving 2020 and Media Credibility Going Forward. A few questions have come in, and I'm going to start this one from Terry Bell with a question, with a quote from Dr. Aggrey Klaaste himself. And he says, the power to change life in our country is in the hands of every South African of every color. And I start with that because Terry Bell is asking quite an important question here and says, does the panel not agree that journalism by its nature is to be the eyes and ears of the public at large, and that the role of journalism, especially in our global economy, in what is essentially a world city, is to serve the interest of humanity at large in terms of producing and publishing the most honest and factual information. As such, should nation building, a political and nationalistic concept, not be the role of any journalist? I'm going to start this with you, Dr. Klaaste, who has the pleasure of having seen the beginning and the birth of the concept of nation building and what Terry Bell is asking us now.
It's fascinating that when Aggrey first mentioned the idea of nation building, I dismissed him as talking nonsense. For the simple reason that at that time, we were determined to bring the apartheid government down. And so the intention was pull it down, destroy it, and then build from scratch. But he has the foresight to think that beyond apartheid, there was going to be a society that needed to rebuild. I mean, if you look at the South African Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution shows the amount of work that we planned to do as a nation. And his point was that each person is responsible for that work. And it's not just South Africa, as Terry says, not just South Africa, it's a worldwide thing, that it's the downtrodden who must be heard who must be able to influence the shape of society. And the journalist is an important bridge in that world. Without journalists, the ordinary Madlamene out in the street will not be heard, will be forgotten. What Tami was saying, that we forget poverty. We are trying to say each person, including Madlamene, must be heard, and whatever they say must contribute to the new shape that our society takes. Thanks, Terry.
And Nwabisa, Dr. Mazwai mentioned there that it's not a common practice that the lived realities of South Africans are reflected in our content as we publish every day. Are there structural limitations to being able to do this?
I think Mahlatse, yes, it kind of depends, from newsroom to newsroom. But I think generally, yes, there are, because I think perhaps we don't agree as journalists and as editors, etc., on what exactly is our mandate. And I think once we begin to agree on what exactly are we supposed to do beyond just telling stories, what are these stories supposed to do, then we may actually open our eyes to the fact that a lot of people, the majority of people in South Africa, are wanting to see their voices reflected in the platforms that we've created. And I think once we start having that kind of conversation, of course, I mean, depending on what media house you work for, it may be easier. I think for us, for example, at Sowetan, it's very much, like a people-centered, and Black people in particular, people-centered platform. But I think there may be, structural issues, particularly when it comes to, if you're talking about, who do advertisers actually want to see? So what do you represent? I think those questions, and uncomfortable questions as they may, but I think it's those questions that we need to answer.
Thank you, Nwabisa. Sbu, there is a question here from Lindy who is asking, should there be a limit to media freedom? SANEF exists to defend our freedom as an institution. But the question, I'm assuming, comes in where sometimes there is a notion out there that the media does overreach at times.
I think it goes without saying that SANEF, as you're saying, exists to ensure media freedom, and we do believe that the media should be able to exercise its duty free and also without any hindrance. So I think on that one, it goes without saying. But I think, as you are saying, the most important point there is the issue goes back to the whole issue of credibility, where sometimes there's a feeling that as the media, we are a law unto ourselves and that we are not accountable to anyone. I think the point there then becomes, what are we doing about that as the media to ensure that not only do we regain that trust which has been lost and also bridge that gap between the trust deficit that exists between us and our audiences, but also to say that, for instance, I think one of the biggest issues currently is the issue of co-regulation, where you have some companies and also online and print media companies that are not subscribing to the Press Council, which in a way then says that as a member of the public, you may feel wronged or affronted by a particular title, but the fact that they are not a party to this regulatory regime, which the rest of the media is part of, that then means that there are no outlets for them to raise their issues. And I think that when we talk about the media credibility, the independent media credibility report that will be coming out, one of the issues we ask for there as SANEF is to say we want the panel to look into the issue of co-regulation and actually to get to a point where we can even recommend that all media houses, all publications, be they online and print, be accountable to some structure, and that the self-regulation mechanism does not necessarily work. And also it doesn't, from an optical point of view, I mean, it makes no sense for you to be a judge of your own bias if you're accused of such. So I think that question stems from that feeling, Mahlatse.
Thank you, Zbu. And linked to that, Dr. Mazwai, I'll pose this to you as somebody who's been inside and also can reflect as an observer of the current industry. And Chris Nong is asking, how can we make sure the media doesn't take sides in our politics? And of course, that suggests that the media at times does take sides in our politics.
Thanks very much. I will perhaps first start by perhaps just picking up on what Nwabisa said earlier on. I think that there are certain truths that we must accept, and that is there is always the socialization of society because of technology and other factors. And as people get socialized, they move to a sort of a higher mode of living, if at all you take stock of what Maslow said. So there is no doubt in my mind that the media has sort of been part of this socialization to the extent of forgetting that there are people in the squatter camps, in the informal settlements, in the rural areas, and so on, except to pay that occasional visit. We do not have a concerted campaign that says, as we did in 1977, that says we are black before we are journalists, but how do we as journalists reflect the true aspirations of society? And so on. So we do not have it today. But to come back to your question, that I've always argued that objectivity will always be in the eyes of the beholder. Therefore, it will be very difficult for any journalist not to take sides in terms of the political situation when he has got his own personal personal views on issues as such. So it's going to be difficult to say that the media must not take political sides. What is important is that the media must perhaps differentiate and make it quite clear that this is opinion and this is fact. So therefore, if at all 20 people fall off the roof, that is fact. But if at all, in your view, this party is better than that other party, say so directly. And that is the only way that over time has worked. But to really assume that there's something that is known as objectivity, truth, we all agree that is not universal. Truth is just simply not universal. It will always have a context, whether you like it or not. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mazwai. Truth is not universal. Dr. Joe Crowley, you wanted to add in there?
I wanted to say that we are very myopic when we talk about the credibility of journalism. We look at the poor and we say the media support the middle class and the higher, and they forget the poor. But in the end, if you look at the texture of our journalism, you will find that we haven't done any introspection on our ethics. A simple example, the asset forfeiture unit has been collecting lots of beautiful cars and beautiful houses, etc. And the type of reporting that goes on around that is that we seem to be glamorizing the very evil that we are supposed to be fighting. As I say, when we do that introspection, it has to be very serious and deep introspection. My belief is that look around the world, look for any great storytellers whether they're fiction or they're playwrights or whatever. Ultimately, the great writers are those on the side of the downtrodden, everywhere. And it's important that we as journalists should start from that premise, that we stand for the poor, for the suffering, against the powerful. That should be the foundation of our ethics. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I wanted to then move to a question that was posed around funding. And I thought, Stylie, I can then refer it to you, given that you've had an experience in terms of donor funding for the Daily Maverick. And perhaps you could give us just insights into how that has been positioned and how you have made sure that you still maintain your independence. That is part of the question. And the last part of that question is there any trusted donors to set up media projects out there for those that want to do startups?
Yeah, we've incorporated philanthropic support as part of our revenue mix. And so we formed a nonprofit and put our investigative team and our internship training program and our Maverick Citizen team into that, where we put a lot of the projects and the efforts that are very difficult to fund and support through commercial or other methods into that. And we tried for a long time. It's not easy. We were trying to set that up. It probably, 3+ years it took us to get our first bit of donor funding into that vehicle. So it's not easy, but it is out there and requires sustained efforts and writing proposals and meeting people and having to also weed out the people in the industry, in the donor industry, that you don't necessarily want to work with, don't share vision, don't share the way and style that they like to work. And I think with regards to taking money from donors for specific projects, we obviously make sure that our editorial independence is upfront and is laid down on the table as a non-negotiable. But it's the same thing as taking, as was mentioned earlier, is advertising revenue or money from governments or money from readers. Money and funding comes from every possible source out there. And, the only way that you can protect your independence is to practice your independence day in, day out, and to do that and show to your readers that it is never compromised, because, the influences or the ability or the attempts to influence will come. Some donors won't do that. Some advertisers won't exert any pressures, but some will. And I think it's about building the culture within the organization, from the leadership down into to everyone else, to know that this is our policy. This is how we deal with these circumstances when they come up, and to practice them day in and day out.
Just to continue on that and to answer to Dr. Mazwai's earlier question around would we accept government funding? Of course, in this country, we do have some experience of a president who, of course, or a time when the government had wanted or provided advertising revenue to a media house with the view of influencing content. So I guess from a history and lessons learned, we come from that era. So would we actually position ourselves as willing to accept that help from the government? And if we do, how do we then protect our own independence? Because we don't want to fall into those who see us to be playing the tune of the piper.
Mahlatsi, in that Swedish model that Dr. Mazwai spoke about, he actually underlined why the argument that says that government support is tantamount to being bought by the government. The reality here is that we are at a point now as an industry where we're looking at various models in terms of ensuring our sustainability. I mean, Stiley has a perfect example, and in terms of their model as a donor-funded model, I mean, it is working perfectly, but the reality is, as he also points out, it is not for everyone. It will not work for everyone. And there are different types of interventions that can be made to ensure that we assist the media industry. But in my view, Mahlatsi, I think that a government assisting its media is actually an exercise in strengthening the very democracy that we all claim to love and to uphold. And I think it is also important that in the same way as the media, if we are funded by the government, or there are some sections of the media or some sections of the media that are funded by the government, it will be transparent, it will be above board, everyone will be able to see, and it will be able for any member of the public to say that because you are funded by the government, your reporting is either skew or in favor of the government. So I think the most important thing for me is, one, even if we are assisted by the government one way or the other, we are transparent about that. But also we uphold the very same ethics that we espouse, and more importantly, ensure that the more media voices we have, because currently, if you look at the current scenario, we have over 80 local small knock and drops that have had to close down over the lockdown period. Now that goes into the heart of the very issues that Joe is raising, talking about Umankomo, and that Dr. Mazwai speaks about in reflecting the poor and Black South Africans. It is those communities that are losing their voice, because what happens, media companies tend, even those that had bureaus, the moment they start closing bureaus, it means that they start becoming inward looking and focusing on the urban center. And then what you have is that you actually have a large section of the society that is disenfranchised. So if the government support helps to ensure that those voices are heard and they're reflected, and that their stories and narratives are heard, then so be it.
Thank you very much, Sue. And I guess also, if we have plurality of voices, we can have more of the South African stories told. But the smaller news media we have, it means that only some stories will actually get to be told, and that power of the community media there. Nwabisa, I'm going to direct this question to you because it's one that comes up every now and again. I've lost bits of it, but what it was asking is if traditional news media is actually being challenged by the advent of social media.
Is the question that is traditional news media being challenged by social media? I think so, absolutely. I mean, I think the way things are right now, a lot of people like to say everybody sees themselves as a journalist. So if you see anything on the streets or if you know something, you probably are likely to tweet it or put it on whatever platform. But in my view, does that mean that traditional media is irrelevant? I don't think so. I think, yes, I mean, at the moment, we are using even these social media platforms to put out our message. But importantly, I think it's vital then for us to basically ramp up what is our credibility. Anybody can put out anything on any platform at any given time. But I think when we as journalists, we've got systems in place to ensure that, the art of verification, to check things, to double check things. And this is why it's so important that we actually, excel in doing that, because that is the thing that really kind of sets us apart than any kind of ordinary person putting out anything on a platform.
And Dr. Crowley, here there's Bushi Matlala, just to add to what Nwabisa was saying, how do we enhance the credibility of media on social media versus fake news? I guess this is in that answer that Nwabisa gave, where people think because there is social media, you then don't need traditional media. But I guess the answer is that you actually need it even more.
There was a time when the Sowetan was the biggest selling daily newspaper in the country. And it was simply because whatever people picked up on the SABC, they had to check its authenticity by reading the newspapers. And that's how the Sowetan became so popular, people didn't believe what they saw on the SABC. Now, in the same way, it's important for us to develop credibility that will say to people, whatever it is you read on social media, you have to check with the professional media. Now, it's very difficult to make that shift, but it's important that the professional media play a very important role in improving their own credibility. The other thing that does worry me is that the social media, the person who picks up stories in the social media needs a filter to be able to say, do I believe this? Don't I believe this? And one of the roles of the standard media is to ensure that they develop filters that their readers, their listeners, their viewers can use to test the credibility of the information they're receiving.
Thank you very much. We are quickly running out of time, so I'm going to give each one of you just a minute in terms of what is the one thing that needs to happen to ensure our sustainability as an industry and to restore our credibility. I will start with you, Dr. Mazwai, in a minute.
I'm going to bring in something perhaps that people will home and think about. I normally see a news report where an organization like COSAS has a press conference in which it is going to the class boycott or a march to Johannesburg and so on. And we as adults know this is sheer irresponsibility. These are small children, but we give that a lot of publicity. What does it do to the credibility of the media as a respectable entity that is interested in the progress in our country? This is just what I want to leave everybody with that question, because it has bugged me time and again when we give publicity to entities who it is quite obvious that they don't have the interest of the country at heart. Thanks very much.
A controversial point there, and I think that's one for a whole other debate. Nobisa?
I think we need to rebuild a social pact. I think between ourselves as journalists, as well as the people in the communities that we serve. I think a lot of our problems really come from the fact that we no longer have the kind of eyes that we had. We no longer have the kind of trust that we had. And I think if we, in our daily operations, in every decision that we make, in all investments that we do, that we be mindful of the fact that if we are unable to rebuild that social pact and unable to rebuild that trust, that not only do we lose in terms of the businesses that we're in, but actually South Africa loses, because it loses people who are wanting to expose really what the realities of our country are.
Thank you, Nobisa. Styling?
If we are to be editorially independent, we need to be financially independent. And I think that if we have an over-reliance on one or two revenue streams, then the risk becomes great, either that potentially our independence is compromised, or that revenue stream could be suddenly taken away from us. And so I think if we are to solve this problem, we can't hang on to the past. We need to look forward. We need to look to the future. We need to lean into this transformation of our organizations that needs to happen, and we need to stop resisting that, and we need to just accept that is our reality, and the only way out is through.
Thank you very much, Styling. Spoo? And
thank you, Mahlatsi. I think the important thing is that as we meet today to celebrate the likes of Aggrey Klaaste, it is important for us that we ensure that we're able to carry forward the work that they do. And I think more importantly, our credibility, our sustainability are at the center of that. So for us, in as much as we are having these conversations as the media about the legacies of the likes of Aggrey Klaaste and Phese Qoboza, we need everyone to understand that it is not only our job and our role as the media to ensure that there's a sustainable and an independent and a critical media in this country. It is actually the role and it is the responsibility of every freedom-loving South African in this country. And more importantly, ours as the media, we should be able to operate in an environment where we're able to truly reflect and tell the South African story.
Joe?
Smoo and Mahlatsi, I think you are perfectly placed to try and implement the idea that's playing in my head. We have seen a lot of competition amongst the struggling media houses. And it's vital that we have an industry in Ndaba that cuts across our competitive nature and say the media are important for our society, not just as businesses, but for democracy. How do we make sure that we have a sustainable industry? And I think, as I say, I think SANEF is in a position to try and pull all the strengths into such an endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Smoo nodding, so I will say that is a challenge accepted, Joe. With your guidance, I think it's one that we will be taking forward. Thank you very much to my panelists. Before I wrap up, I just want to hand over to Me Pinky Klaaste, who of course has been joining us for this inaugural Aggrey Klaaste Colloquium for a few words.
Hello, everyone. Thank you to the host, to the speakers, and all the partners. Thank you for remembering my late husband, Ntate Aggrey Klaaste. Ruri re motlotlo haholo bagešo. God bless.
Thank you very, very much, Mayor, and also allowing us to hold on and anchor our freedom on his name. Unfortunately, that's all we had time for. I just want to say thank you very, very much to all of my panelists. We had Dr. Joe Crowley, who is the chair of the Aggrey Klaaste Trust, Mrs. Nwabisa Makunga, who is the editor-in-chief of the Sowetan, Sibusiso, and also Treasurer General of the South African National Editors Forum, Sbu Ngalwa, who is the chairperson of SANEF and also political editor at Newsroom Africa, Dr. Tammy Mazwai, who is Commissioner at the National Planning Commission, and of course, Mr. Stali Karalambas, who is the CEO of the Daily Maverick. On behalf of the Aggrey Klaaste Annual Aggrey Klaaste Trust, I would like to say special thanks to the Wits University for partnering with us on the SANEF, of course, and also DM5 Attorneys. We are truly grateful. This is the beginning of many more so that we can actually ensure that the legacy that Mr. Klaaste left us continues, and also ensure that we restore the credibility that is necessary for our journalism to ensure that our country thrives and our democracy is strengthened. Thank you very, very much for everybody who joined us this afternoon.